Welcome, everybody. I'm John Haig. I'm the co-director of the Mossavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government. They're telling me sorry. For all of you online, I'm John Haig. I'm the co-director of the Mossavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government. We're extremely fortunate today to talk about green industrial policy. And it's nice to see a lot of familiar student faces in the audience. So we have Robert Lawrence, who is a faculty member here at the Kennedy School, tenured faculty member for many years. Edo Campanella is a research fellow here. I'll let them do more of the introductions. Anna Stansbury is at the Sloan School, and once upon a time was here as an MPP student many years ago. But today we're talking about green industrial growth. I will turn it over to Edo to kick us off. And welcome everybody, thanks for coming. And I know you always appreciate the free lunch. The center will always have free lunches.
So thanks a lot, John, and good morning, everyone. It's an honor for me to moderate this panel about one of the hottest topics of our time, both from macroeconomic and geopolitical perspective. John forgot to mention that Anne and I have something in common because we used to be teaching fellow for Robert back in the day. So this feels like a sort of extended family reunion to some extent. So the structure of the panel is the usual. The first 30-40 minutes will be an exchange among the three of us. Then we will open up the floor for questions from the audience. So I think the goal of this conversation is really to bring some clarity about the debate surrounding industrial policies. For the last 3-4 decades, industrial policy was the policy that could not be named. Gary Baker, Nobel laureate at Chicago University, once said that the best industrial policy is the one that does not exist. So now the consensus within the economic profession is changing, also because of what's happening from a geopolitical and political perspective around the world. So we will really try to bring some clarity, leveraging the insight from the economic literature. And maybe, Anna, we can start from you. I would like to know how you assess the return of industrial policy from a pure economic perspective, whether it is possible to draw a line between good and bad industrial policy.
Yeah, thank you, Edo. Can everyone hear me okay with the mic at the back? Yep, great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. It's a nice homecoming, both MPP-wise and also, as Edo said, as a former teaching fellow for Robert and Larry Summers' class on globalization. So it's great to be back. I wanted to start by just kind of giving us a shared definition of industrial policy, because I think this is often something that is elided in the discussion as people are actually talking past each other because they mean different things. We're going to take is pretty broad. It's from a recent review paper by 3 of the leading scholars in this sort of resurgence of research on industrial policy, which is Reka Uhash, Nathan Lane, and Danny Roderick. And they define industrial policy as the set of policies that governments employ to try to change the structure of economic activity in pursuit of some public goal. And so that can include things like import protection, subsidies, but also other kinds of things like the provision of specific inputs that a specific industry might require, the coordination of different actors to kind of promote the growth of a specific sector. But the goal is to change the sectoral or industrial structure of economic activity in some way. And to kind of understand why we are where we are now, I think it's useful to understand what the critiques were in the kind of conventional view of industrial policy and what's changed. So I've bucketed those critiques into three sections. The first is a skepticism that government can do industrial policy. And that's for 2 reasons. First, because it takes a lot of information for government to know what sectors to promote and how to promote them. If you're thinking about what the next big successful export industry in the US might be, you've got a whole range of possible sectors to choose from. Why would the government be able to aggregate that information better than the market and then choose what instruments are necessary better than the market could? This is a kind of watered down version of the famous sort of socialist calculation problem. Like, why and when can the government actually have the relevant knowledge to understand what economic activity is going to be productive and efficient? The other set of kind of critiques as to why the government might not be able to do it is not about competence or information, it's about politics, it's about political capture. And that the moment that you open up the role for government in selecting between industries, between firms, between places, that opens up a role for lobbying, for corruption, for political capture in a way that even in theory, if the government could do this effectively, in practice, maybe they won't. So those are the kind of bucket of skepticism as to whether this can be done. The second bucket of skepticism about industrial policy has been, is this the first best way to achieve the goals? And I think this is something that is going to be very relevant in our conversation today, because when we're talking about the new industrial policy, today we're talking particularly about green industrial policy, but really people are bucketing industrial policy or targeting industrial policy towards at least 4 different types of outcomes. One is productivity, efficiency. Can the US or another country move into a new sector and then be a world leader in that sector? Whether that's advanced materials, whether that's biotech, right? One is we want to accelerate the pace of technological progress for a specific public good. So in the past, that might have been the space race. You want to accelerate the progress because of national defense reasons. Now it might be green technology. There's a public good in accelerating the pace of technological progress in climate tech. The third is obviously national security and resilience to supply chain disruptions, wars, pandemics. And then the fourth, I'm sort of calling inequality, but that's the promotion of better jobs, the regeneration of declining areas, the re-employment of people who've lost employment in big sectors like manufacturing. Those 4 goals are all very different. And the idea that one set of industrial policy tools is able to successfully meet all of those 4 goals is unlikely, right? You can kill maybe 2 birds with 1 stone, but killing 4 birds with 1 stone, they have to be very, very conveniently aligned to be able to do so. So that's the second question is, even if we can do industrial policy, which of these goals should we be trying to meet? And are there better instruments to meet each of those goals? And then the third is just a cost-benefit question. And I think when we think about why the consensus has changed, which was Edo's question to me, really the bulk of our knowledge has changed on these latter buckets. We still don't know very well whether and how and in what circumstances government can successfully have the information to do industrial policy well and to avoid political capture. But on the targeting question, it may be that the first best options feel like they've been foreclosed. Maybe the first best option to reach climate change goals was a carbon tax. But in the event that this has not happened, then second best sets of options start to seem more promising and more worthy of scrutiny and more worthy of action. And also that there's been a lot of new evidence on this cost-benefit question. So if you were thinking 20 years ago about declining manufacturing and what might replace it, there was evidence from the past in the US that when towns declined and unemployment rose, people left and moved and found new opportunities and their skills were able to be reemployed elsewhere. And we've seen with the more recent evidence of the last 20 years that while globalization and the decline of manufacturing has been on net beneficial, there have been these concentrated pockets of deprivation that have not been able to adjust. And so the costs of not doing targeted industrial policy may seem greater now than they did in the past. So I'd argue this reevaluation has come more from a reflection of the fact that there are fewer other options and higher costs of not acting than necessarily a reevaluation of the quality or the capacity to do industrial policy per se.
Thanks. So basically, I think using your definition of targeting specific sector to trigger a sort of structural change in the economy, probably the purpose of industrial policy, at least at the beginning, is to trigger a sort of investment boom in the industries that the industrial policies are supposed to target. And if I ask someone from the Biden administration whether their industrial policies are working, obviously, I think they would say yes. It would be a resounding yes. And they would probably point to a single figure that is basically the construction of new factories across the US. We are basically witnessing a boom. And it's something that is happening only here in the US. We are not seeing anything like that, for instance, in Europe. And it is also counterintuitive, considering that it is taking place at the time when the Fed is tightening its monetary policy at an unprecedented pace. So, Robert, my question to you is whether you think industrial policies will lead to a broad, sustained and sustainable investment boom that goes beyond just building new factories, but will lead to investment in other kind of assets as well.
Thank you. The Biden administration has sold its industrial policy as an integral part of its approach of building back better. The idea is that what we need to do is to build the economy from the bottom up and the middle out, to quote the president. And the instruments that it has chosen, although there are, of course, new goals. And by the way, I think it's not so much that the research has suddenly convinced people we need industrial policy. It's that the kind of problems that the administration are facing are classic public goods problems. And we know that the private market will not give us the optimal solution, or in most cases when we have these public goods. So climate change, national defense, technological development are all riddled with market failures. The new concern about resilience is likewise something which isn't automatically taken care of when you think about an integrated economy. But if you actually look, so the particular vehicle that the nation has chosen, or the particular industry, is not to accept that manufacturing is today only 8.6% of total employment in the United States, but to claim that by specifically concentrating the policies on manufacturing, you're going to be able to achieve the social goals of raising workers who don't have a college degree in a way, or helping the forgotten areas, the Rust Belt, in a significant way. That's where I think there's a fundamental, and it's basically in the arithmetic. Those manufacturing is simply too small today. Manufacturing accounts for 8.6%. And I've been crunching some numbers where I've taken, Edo quoted that there's been a huge increase in manufacturing investment. It's virtually doubled in the last year. And the President Biden had a tour in which he's gone around and claimed that there's a complete industrial renaissance. And in fact, in some parts of the United States, there are major increases in employment. The administration has also tabulated private announcements. So it's not just their own policy, seem to have generated increased investment. And if you look at some states, Arizona, for instance, my estimate would be that their manufacturing employment is going to increase by about 80%. West Virginia, 54%. Idaho, 47%. New York, 25%. Sounds like a lot. And these big numbers boggle people's minds. But actually, if you calculate on balance, what's the total number of jobs? What would be a reasonable estimate of the manufacturing employment you're going to create? You'll get very clear. 150 million is the labor force in the United States. So there is no way that you're going to generate something that you could call the nation of the middle class, or improve well-being of the 70% of Americans who don't have a college degree, or regeneration of the forgotten places, left behind places, or Rust Belt, with these policies. They may well achieve their specific stated goals. So the IRA may improve the environment. The infrastructure bill is going to improve infrastructure. The CHIPS bill will definitely improve investment and has increased a lot of new plants in semiconductors. But those are only in total rather small sections of the economy. And for me, what's been disappointing is that although it has paid lip service to the need, for instance, to help those hurt by globalization, the administration has actually abandoned the meager trade adjustment assistance program that we once had. And we don't have good labor market adjustment policies. If you look at the amount of money the United States actually spends on regional development, the federal government commitments are pathetic. They're the smallest among the country. So my point in closing this comment would be that we've got policies. We can go into whether or not they're going to succeed in their stated goals, but in the broad goal of changing the nature of the US labor market so that it pays off for those who have done so poorly over 5 decades, and the places and people who have not participated in economic growth, I don't think this is the solution. Much closer may be keeping the economy at full employment. That has much more potential than all of these sectoral and industrial policies put together. We do find that an economy which can maintain strong employment without inflation is the best kind of thing you can do for those at the bottom of the labor market.
So thanks a lot, Robert. So basically, the purpose of these policies is to create, to trigger an investment boom that should lead to an employment boom. And Robert just said that we need to be careful about what we can expect in terms of a number of jobs that can be created. And I think there is also another dimension of the problem. It's not only an issue of quantity of jobs, but also quality of jobs. And by quality, I don't mean just well-paid jobs, secure jobs, but I refer more to the skill content of these jobs. Because if the purpose is to create employment opportunity for workers who are at the margins of the labor market, you need to make sure that the jobs that are created match the skills of these workers. Otherwise, you don't solve the unemployment problem, you don't solve the inequality problem. So, Anna, given your reading of the economic literature, what can we expect in this sense? Do you feel there might be an issue of skill mismatch between the jobs that are going to be created and those that are going to be destroyed by these industrial policies?
Thanks. Yeah, and let me just add that I very much agree with what Robert said there. The scale of the goal of revitalizing the middle class is far sort of surpassed, the scale of the challenge is far surpassed by what is done with all these policies, even if they will still do quite a lot in specific places or for specific groups. So the mismatch problem that Edo is referring to, I think is quite prevalent along 2 dimensions. One is skills, which, as you mentioned, so revitalizing green tech manufacturing, advanced manufacturing, semiconductors. Advanced manufacturing jobs nowadays tend to require a relatively high level of education, relatively high level of specific skills, in a way that a lot of the manufacturing and extractive industries jobs that have been disappearing and will continue to disappear with the green transition tended to require less of. And so there's just a very present and clear skill mismatch in part between the new jobs that will be created versus the jobs that are lost in this process. Different estimates from different papers, differ as to how big those mismatches are. But to the first order approximation, there is an upskilling requirement in the labor force that is present if we need to revitalize advanced manufacturing. Then there's also the location mismatch, which to some extent may be more severe than the skill mismatch issue. And that's because the places where the dirty industries have been located have typically been there for a reason that is not the reason why you would locate a new clean industry or a new green tech plant there. So an obvious example would be coal mining or would be fracking, where you're located where the resource is. And these places are often very rural, not very well connected to anywhere else, not in large cities with agglomeration economies and modern technology. And so in that case, then there's a trade-off when you're designing industrial policy between locating the new opportunities where the old opportunities disappeared, but at some pretty non-trivial economic cost, because it will be much more expensive or difficult to become competitive producing high-tech producing solar in a place that just happened to be a place that used to have coal, rather than choosing in the most efficient location. And that matters because people, as I said before, don't seem to be moving as much. There are lots of factors in the US labor market that lock people in place. And so by not locating the industries there, you then get this geographic mismatch where the new opportunities are going to the places where people are already doing relatively well on the whole. The current structure of the Biden administration plans is trying to square that by prioritizing places that have been disadvantaged or left behind. But there is this trade-off in terms of the cost. So I think in some ways, the bigger issue about the mismatch is, what is the problem we're trying to solve here? And there are actually, I think, three distinct problems when you think about the labor market issue of the green transition and the industrial policy transition and reshoring, whatever we want to call this moment. One is what to do with the workers who will lose jobs and be laid off. And we're most worried about the people who have acquired skills in that industry, have put down roots in that place, and therefore it's really hard for them to switch jobs and it's really hard for them to move. You're thinking of sort of middle-aged workers in manufacturing and mining in places that aren't going to otherwise thrive. The other question is what to do with all of the workers that would have gone into those industries but didn't, and so need to be retooled to move place or to move industry but haven't yet invested in it. And then the other question is how to make sure we have a skilled workforce for the green transition. And often when we talk about it, we're conflating all three of those and we're saying, well, could the disemployed coal miners become coders and can they move from West Virginia to the Bay Area? I mean, I'm being extreme on purpose. But the fact is there are three different problems that could each have different targeted solutions. The labor market is always reallocating. People are leaving jobs very, very frequently. The US is one of the highest turnover labor markets in the world. And so if we acknowledge that there are a lot of other good jobs and a lot of other good sectors, you know, healthcare employs more people than manufacturing does, retail employs more people than manufacturing does, leisure and hospitality employs more people than manufacturing does, then I think what we should be thinking about is how do we retool the people who've lost their jobs and protect them to get a good job in any of these big sectors that are constantly hiring and growing? And separately, how do we find and develop a skill pipeline for the new skills that we need in these new industries we want to promote? And by separating that question, we can kind of develop active labor market policies and social insurance policies to help the former group and training pipelines to help the latter group and achieve balance without having to square that circle quite so tightly.
So thanks a lot, Anne. And I think this naturally leads to a question about how to design industrial policies in an effective and proper way. Robert has an interesting book that is coming out in November. Its title is Behind the Curve, Can Manufacturing Still Provide Inclusive Growth? And in that book, he devotes a lot of space and energy to the details of, for instance, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Chips and Science Act. So in your opinion, what's missing in this legislation, and would it be possible from a policy perspective to design them in a more effective way?
Well, I think it goes back to politics. Because it seems very difficult in the United States for the federal government to actually have a program that would be designed to help workers or to help places in a significant way. I mean, it was very striking to me that the Secretary of Labor was completely out of the picture when these policies were implemented. In fact, he spent half his time outside of Washington. He used to be the mayor of Boston. So instead of having these broad labor market policies or broad revitalization programs, which I would say are present, for instance, in Europe's green policies. In the United States, the only way they could kind of get some programs through was to put them in the IRA or in the CHIPS Act. So the result was that the solutions they came up with, for instance, for energy communities which are dependent on fossil fuels, were to give extra bonuses for people who invest in those areas in renewables. So they did exactly what Anna was referring to, they ought not to do necessarily. It doesn't mean, although it does turn out actually that Wyoming is produces a third of the coal in the United States, and it's a good place for wind. Texas is a lot of oil, and it's going to do okay for solar and for wind as well. But by and large, that's not the solution to those places' problems. So there's not only a mismatch in the sort of worker sense, but there's a mismatch in the geographic potential. Some areas don't have much potential, let's be honest. For those workers, we should think about helping them move. We're oriented too heavily in some ways to state and local provision of these services. But we need to enhance their mobility. You could imagine giving a worker a choice when you give them their unemployment insurance. There's also, and I think this is where I referred earlier to the high pressure economy helping, there's the sense we have a shortage of skills. But one of the deficiencies in our labor market is that our employers are very lazy in the sense that they use having a college degree as demarcating whether you are sufficiently skilled for a specific job, when in many cases, you could actually do the job quite well without having gone to college. Now, to his credit, the governor of Pennsylvania, recently reformed their system, and the federal government has some nice language about this, but there's an effort being made to try to put people on in jobs where there's a ladder, not dead-end jobs, but jobs where they can actually pursue a career, but where they don't need to have 4 years of college in order to signal that they are actually qualified. What they may need are specific training programs where they can obtain a specific skill. And some of the large IT companies, like actually all the large IT companies today, but particularly say Amazon, who's not totally altruistic, realizes we need a lot of operators for the cloud, but you can do a course for 6 weeks or 8 weeks, and you can get the skills to become a cloud operator, and that can plug you in to a job which in a sense allows you to move up a career ladder. So that's one way to do it. You can try to reorient the mindsets of those who are hiring. I think nothing reorients the mindsets of those who are hiring than a high pressure economy. Maybe a war can do it as well. Rosie the Riveter was the arch female worker who filled the plants when the men went off to war during the Second World War. And we do see in our economies, when the unemployment rate and the labor market is as tight as the one we currently have, that more and more opportunities are created for people to occupy jobs where earlier it was believed they weren't capable of actually doing the job. So I think there's something happening there, and that's why I say the high pressure economy is a very important contributor, but I think there needs to be much more reorientation towards skills where they are genuinely in short supply, or workers who can actually do jobs but aren't given the opportunity.
So in a way, the Amazon example point to a bottom-up approach that is more effective than a top-down approach. That is actually what we are talking about today. I have one more question for Anna and Robert, then we let you jump in the conversation. So Anna, in the past, the process of industrialization was associated with a rise of trade union. A few years ago, you wrote an important paper with Larry Summers, where you were basically making the point that the wage stagnation that has been experienced by the average American worker for the last 4 or 5 decades has much to do with a decline in workers' power. So what kind of role do you think a trade union should play in this maybe a little bit utopian process of reindustrialization?
Yeah, it's a great question and super important. I'm going to just quickly riff on something Robert said, and then I'll come to that, because I think this point about helping people move is crucial if we want to think about industrial policy in a way that's going to succeed with the industry distribution we have and the place distribution we have. But it's also crucial to remember that part of helping people to move is just removing some of the silly barriers to moving that there are right now, some easier and harder to remove. The most obvious one is housing costs. A very big reason people are no longer moving to the places that pay, where jobs pay a lot of money, is because it doesn't pay anymore. So if you look at people without a high school degree, without a college degree, the average net return to moving to a high wage city from a low wage city is 0 net of housing costs, because housing costs are so high. So improving housing supply and housing costs in high wage places will help that transition be smoother. But also there's a lot of stuff with the federal system that could easily be changed. So state-specific occupational licensing, a lot of jobs require occupational licensing, from healthcare jobs to cosmetology and hairdressing jobs, all sorts of different types of jobs. Mostly those licenses are not recognized across state lines. That makes it very hard for people to move or for their partners to move. Health insurance, typically with a job, that creates job lock. It's demonstrated that reduces people's abilities to sort of take risks and move to new places. State-specific welfare benefits and social security benefits that aren't easy to transfer, again, make it harder for people to take that risk to move. And so when we're thinking about creating an economy that is able to bear this big industrial shift, removing the barriers to moving and to reallocating workers across place is a huge part of that. But on unions, so this is a really crucial question. And obviously this is something that the Biden admin industrial policy and the EU's new industrial policy are both taking a strong stance on, bringing labor to some extent into the picture of this project. And my work with Larry Summers and plenty of other economists' work is very consistent with the idea that the rapid decline in private sector unionization in the US was a big contributor to, albeit not the only contributor to, the rise in inequality that we've seen. So rising labor income inequality, the declining share of income that goes to labor as opposed to capital, because one of the roles that unions can play in the private sector is reallocating some of the gains of production towards workers, and particularly lower and middle income workers, away from higher income workers and capital owners. So the positive vision of labor being involved in a new industrial strategy would be that some of this new prosperity that's created is more broadly shared than it otherwise would have been. The unionization rate currently in the private sector in the US is 6%. So without a very substantial conscious boost to unions' involvement in the new manufacturing, in the new industries that are spawned as a result of the multipliers, that role is going to be pretty small. On the negative side, of course, thinking about trade-offs, union labor typically costs more. That's partly why it reallocates prosperity. And so thinking about trade-offs between goals, is the cheapest way to meet the goals of the green transition the same way as the one that will generate the most broadly shared prosperity and the best jobs? Probably not. There are going to be trade-offs in that respect. And of course, it can be exclusionary. So thinking about giving opportunities based on union membership or union contracting rights, then ask questions about who actually gets access to union membership in the first place. And so the question of democratization of unions in the labor movement becomes key. So I think those two factors need to be traded off. And some of the way you're seeing, for example, the electric vehicle type support being allocated is, I think, trying to thread that needle. But what I think is actually a more interesting possible role for Labour, and is one that is not currently, the US is not really currently set up for, is the revitalization of industrial policy and sector-specific strategies basically calls for sector-level, long-term strategic decision-making. If you look at countries that have sectoral bargaining systems, those are actually systems which are probably more set up to provide the information and the structures that lead to a successful policy on that front. So a sectoral bargaining system would, broadly speaking, be a tripartite bargaining system where employer representatives, worker representatives, usually unions, and government are all coming together to bargain over wages and working conditions for the industry, but also typically to bargain over other things. So the German system, for example, the unions take a very central role in skill development, in apprenticeships, and in figuring out how to build the pipeline of workers to meet the needs of the industry in the future. The sectoral bargaining discussions will often focus on things like export competitiveness and innovation. And so to the extent that policy is moving more towards a world where decisions are being taken at a national strategic sectoral long-term level, I think that sort of boosts the case for a sectoral level involvement of worker representatives, not just for this broadly shared prosperity question, but also for the question of skill building in the future of the industry, where agglomerating that information from all different parties can actually be particularly helpful. So that's where I would hope to see it going. Of course, the current political and legislative environment in the US doesn't look like there would be any formal enshrinement of sectoral bargaining in any meaningful way, but it's definitely on the table and people are thinking about it.
So thanks, Anna. And maybe this can be an opportunity to look at more the global picture. There is a risk that this wave of industrial policy will generate market distortion and fuel a subsidy race. For instance, in Europe, European government were really annoyed by the CHIPS Act, and even more probably by the Inflation Reduction Act that has nothing to do with inflation, actually. And so a little, not much. Do you see, I mean, also given what you teach, I remember when I was your teaching fellow, I mean, you were always clear that trade is good because it leads to specialization, but it also creates other problems, winners and losers, and you need to take care of losers. So probably we are where we are now because we forgot about the losers. But still, do you see a risk that this wave of industrial policy will lead actually to more expensive goods for consumer and lower output, and so a lower welfare overall?
Yes, I think Anna touched on very important. She made this point about when you try to achieve a single, a major. You have one instrument, and you have many policy goals that you'd like to achieve. You are going to get into trouble. This is Jan Tinbergen, one of the first Nobel Prize winners. He had this brilliant insight. It's better to have more instruments if you have one target, but don't try and have many targets. And in effect, in the Inflation Reduction Act, what we have are a slew of subsidies that reflect these multiple goals. A bonus if you invest in renewable energy, but you get 6 times the bonus in your tax credit if the workers are unionized and if they have an apprenticeship program. So, and then you get an additional bonus if you use US local content, which is part of what has given rise to a lot of the frictions. And you get an additional bonus if it's in an energy community or a formerly depressed area. So how many goals and how many objectives do we have? And in particular, in Europe, they realized when you set off a subsidy war, particularly among your, in their case, nation states within Europe, what's going to happen at the end of the day is it's not obvious you're going to get more investment by corporations, but they're going to be in different places. So they've tried very hard to put a damper on the competition for location among the states. Well, what's happened in the United States is exactly the opposite. We have tried to stimulate state and local government to chip in and, in a sense, to leverage the federal government's subsidies with subsidies of their own. And so what we've set off is a competition among states for locations of investment. So actually, at the end of the day, who do you think is in the best position to compete? The poor states or the rich states? So what we're going to have, in my view, is more investment in rich states. Exactly the opposite of the original intention of trying to restore these places that are going to be left behind. The other consequence, why did the Europeans do this? Because when you have these competition, who ends up with the money? It's going to be the firms who are going to get paid often for what they would have done anyway. But if everyone's competing for your services, you'll be able to charge more. And I think likewise, the rents and premia that companies are going to get for engaging in green energy are going to be that much larger. So now, if you're sitting in Europe, you can see that you're really angry. It's not just that the Americans are providing subsidies and now you're going to have to try to match them. It's that they've totally undermined your system, which was designed to achieve more equity among the members of Europe and allow the distribution of resources to be done on an efficiency basis as opposed to a national subsidy basis. So I think this is one of the really unfortunate consequences of the Inflation Reduction Act.
So thanks a lot. We have 15 more minutes, so maybe it's time to open up the floor for questions. So some of you have these on the table for a reason. This is a microphone, so for people who are watching us on Zoom. So if you want to ask a question, you need to turn it on, and the light needs to be green. So first question, maybe John.
Oh, so I get the prerogative of being the director of the center. So I'm going to start with Anna's definition of industrial policy, which was basically government actions that have large, seemingly beneficial effects on the structure of economic activity, right? That's kind of the way I
Intend to have beneficial effects. Yeah.
Right. And if you look at kind of the cases of what that might look like, the conversation to me seems to have focused a lot on what I might call some version of place-based policies or whatever, focused on employment issues, questions of employment. There are two other cases to me that seem quite important. One is it's kind of standard promotion of infant industries, and the other is, public R&D of some sort, such as, the space race and investing in the space race kind of activities. And I'd be curious to hear, there are some of our colleagues here at the Kennedy School talk about not thinking of a production function, and that the role of government in industrial policy is really providing complementary inputs to that production function. So, cars aren't particularly useful if you don't have highways, and it was the government that built the highway system, right? So how do you think of it in that sense? And then the second piece of it is somebody like Laura Tyson, who's saying, wait a minute, industrial policy should really be crowding in and accelerating private investment, not be a substitute for it. How do you react to kind of that kind of structure and definition of industrial policy?
You want to go first?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And we definitely did focus more on the employment and place-based aspects, but I think it's right to say there are three different buckets: infant industry, public R&D, and then this sort of place-based policy employment aspects. My read of the evidence, and there was an interesting recent review paper, as well as the one I mentioned. Some colleagues at Peterson Institute have also reviewed various of different buckets of episodes of industrial policy in these categories. That the public R&D section of this has in many ways been the most successful consistently over time with different efforts. So whether that's thinking about the space race, thinking about DARPA, thinking about efforts to accelerate innovation in specific areas. So the North Carolina Research Triangle is, I think, often discussed as a very successful example of that. And so if you're thinking about industrial policy as public sector R&D that provides a mission or a moonshot type goal, whether that's now green technology, I think we have a lot more reason to believe that that can be successful under certain conditions. The infant industry side of it is one where I think there's a lot more questions. There have been historical cases where it seems to have worked very well. South Korea is obviously an example which is hotly debated, but I think the bulk of the evidence falls on the side that that certain industries in South Korea, like chemicals, were very successfully the products of infant industry policy. But that's where I'd sort of bucket it, yeah.
So I think the argument in favor of the government's role in green policies is very strong. If you think about, to extend your example, when you go for electric vehicles, you have to have enough charges. That's that needs to be stimulated. If you want to have electric vehicles to continue with that product, you need power grids. You need electrical grids that are going to transmit the energy that links all those projects that are independent. So there really does seem to, there is the public good dimension of it. Technological development, by the way, there again, there's this effort, and Anna's done some very interesting work on this. There's, technological development tends to be geographically astoundingly concentrated. When you give out the grants for some mysterious reasons, it's only certain institutions that are located in certain places that seem to be able to win the grants. So now there's an effort to say, no, we should have more dispersion. And let's give it out broadly across many different regions. But the question so there's a government policy, but the question is, are those the best people to carry out the R&D? Are you going to sacrifice, or are they going to be just as good as those who've already gained the expertise? So I think there are a lot of problems. Anna began the talk by pointing to the political economy and the political influences that are taking place. And I think in the US today, we have already very influential corporations, and they're all going to be trying to persuade. I think this is one of the huge dilemmas of industrial policy, by the way. On the one hand, you have this danger of political capture. On the other hand, when you look at successful industrial policies, generally, they work because there's a close collaboration between the private firms and the government. Because the private firms have the know-how and they know what the latest technologies are, and they know a lot more than people sitting in their government offices know about these technologies. And so while a lot of people kind of characterize, say, Korean industrial policy as top-down, or Japanese industrial policy as top-down, I think it misses the amount of interaction that is continuously taking place using feedback mechanisms between the government and the private sector. So the perils are that you get captured by the public sector, by the private sector, and on the one hand, and the second peril is that you don't listen to them, and you simply try to do what you think they should be doing. So getting that balance correct is very difficult, and it's especially difficult in the United States, in a system that is very susceptible to political influence. So and in a sense, we've done it successfully in DARPA. We've done it successfully in some, that's in the defense related areas, but it's very hard to draw that line.
So maybe we can collect a couple of questions. I think there is, you can. Yeah, speak louder. Okay. Maybe you.
Sure. My name's Ryan Silber. I'm a mid-career MPA with background in land use policy. I'm curious, when you bring up the idea of local governments bringing in tax incentives for private industry to attract them. There's obviously this tragedy of the commons where we all compete with each other. There's no incentive to back out because you'll lose out on the industry altogether. We saw that with the Amazon headquarters case a few years ago. Some city made a bold step back, and guess what? They didn't get it, and everyone else kept cutting down and offering more incentive. So what do we do as public practitioners where there's this theoretical break-even point where the public benefit and tax revenue is suddenly no longer greater than the externalities and the future costs associated with attracting this industry? How do we make that decision of when to say enough is enough? Federal tax breaks like opportunity areas or local tax increment financing, whatever it might be that we're giving back as an incentive, where do we say no more?
Around industrial policy in US, I think developing economies are also resorting to a lot of industrial policy, especially India. The production-linked incentive scheme in India is doing pretty well, especially in the manufacturing of mobile phones. Tanzania, for instance, a very small country, has been resorting to industrial policy to cut down their import bills on the sugar commodity. So, I mean, what do you think is the future of industrial policy in developing economies, and what's going to happen around that? And if you have policy prescriptions or ideas around how to navigate that in developing economies?
Thanks. Maybe, Robert, do you want to start? You can pick the question you want.
Okay, so the fact is that even today, although it's diminished, 2/3 of all R&D are spent in manufacturing. So I said 8% of the employment is in manufacturing, but a huge amount of the R&D is in manufacturing, and many of the goods. And manufacturing is increasingly technology intensive, so that your Tesla today is basically a computer on wheels. So clearly, this is an area very important for research and development, and we know that private who engage in R&D don't necessarily capture all of the social benefits. There are spillovers from research other than the private returns. So that is an argument for subsidizing R&D. Now, I don't believe it's necessarily one for subsidizing manufacturing. The more direct approach would be to subsidize R&D regardless of where it takes place. Why do we think the spillover will be greater in manufacturing than elsewhere? So I'm not convinced then that I am convinced that manufacturing is special in its R&D intensity, but I don't think the policy implication is then to concentrate on manufacturing necessarily when it comes to R&D. I think it's just as possible that a sector that isn't very technology intensive at the margin could actually do with a little bit more R&D in order to enhance its productivity. And the real challenge today in my view, is how do we make services more productive? So if I had a focus, well, as I say, I wouldn't choose between sectors. That's where I think across the board kind of incentive system is much better. I guess I'll stop.
Okay, Anna, do you want to?
Yeah, to add on the manufacturing, I agree with Robert. And the other point that makes manufacturing different, which is related, is that manufacturing jobs tend to have high wage premia. So someone with a given level of qualifications, if they got the same job, if they got a job in manufacturing, or the same person got a job in retail or transportation, they would be paid more in manufacturing because manufacturing is more productive. And so again, the criteria here that makes manufacturing special is not manufacturing itself, it's that these tend to be high-paying, high productivity jobs, which are good for the people in them, but then also generate sort of multiplier effects, spillovers in the local economy. So prioritizing based on R&D intensity and productive, high-paying jobs might be a better criteria, and maybe manufacturing is just a heuristic for that. I wanted to speak to the tax incentives point. I think this is crucial in the US context. And one of the distinctions that I've seen drawn in the kind of local place-based policy that I think is useful is distinguishing between purely financial incentives versus incentives that are the provision of complementary inputs, going to a point that John raised earlier. So financial incentives, when you're just giving a tax break or a subsidy, are really directly competitive race to the bottom type dynamics across places, where if you've ever studied auction theory, like the exact way it's set up in the US is designed to extract all the value from sort of the authorities that are offering the tax breaks and pass that all to the company essentially. But if the system was competing based on the provision of complementary inputs, the provision of skills, the provision of infrastructure and other kinds of things which are actually involve an investment in the local area rather than a simple financial transfer, that kind of competition, I think there's evidence that can be very effective at allocating resources well, but also allowing places to try and compete on their own comparative advantage. So that would feel like a direction that is more positive than this race to the bottom dynamic. If you want to do the purely financial, I think the way the EU does it is less subject to the race to the bottom dynamic because there's a common set of criteria across place. And so studies that have looked at the EU's I forgot the EU fund names are also bureaucratic. I forget which fund, sorry, but I can send the study that looks at one of the EU's funds that targets the bottom 10% most deprived regions in the EU for additional investment incentives, finds very positive effects on those regions. And there's no gaming of that system because there's a common definition of who can offer these incentives and how big they are and where they come from. So that would be another way, I think, to avoid that race to the bottom while still prioritizing places that are in need. I wanted to say one other thing, actually. I realized I only answered half of John's question at the beginning about how to allocate industrial policies. In what cases are you doomed to choose, in the phrase of Ricardo Hausmann and Danny Roderick? So in some cases, like roads, like electricity, the government is making a choice one way or the other that will shape the direction of the economy. And those cases, you can't avoid industrial policy and you've got to figure out what you're going to do. But there are a lot of other cases which I don't think fall into that bucket, like deciding whether or not the US should be a chip manufacturer or a solar panel manufacturer. And so distinguishing between those two is useful. And the best metaphor I've heard for sort of how industrial policy should be thought of in that sense is from Brad DeLong. And he says, we shouldn't think about replacing the invisible hand. We should be thinking about picking up the invisible hand at the elbow and placing it somewhere else. And then when it's placed there, let the invisible hand do its work, entrepreneurship, market incentives, allocation, but it's about reshaping that direction of where those market forces are going. And I think that's the kind of best way to think about it.
So great. So I'm told that we actually have the room until 1:15, so we have some more time for questions. Maybe we start from there.
Mads Jensen, visiting fellow at Center for European Studies.
Can you speak a bit
I'll speak louder.
Okay,
Mads Jensen, Center for European Studies. I'm a visiting fellow there. To what extent should we factor in the role of social status when looking at industrial policy? Because we have quite compelling evidence showing that even though we are successful in moving people from the manufacturing sector into the service sector, they still feel unhappy and discontent because they are experiencing a status decline, the loss of industrial identity. So should we also take that into account when we are crafting industrial policies?
Thanks. Do you want to ask?
Hey, I'm Neil Sandler. I'm a visiting PhD fellow at MIT Sloan. I was recently part of a similar event in Berlin, where Chiara Chioscolo from the OECD was mentioning that so far very little rigorous empirical evidence exists on what works in terms of industrial policies. And I'm wondering if you agree, and if so, what are the biggest questions, Robert? You mentioned many trade-offs, on how to design those policies most effectively. And I'm wondering if you agree, and what are your thoughts on that? Thanks.
Are there other questions? Okay, maybe we go back and then we again.
Hi.
A bit louder.
Can you hear me now? Okay, so I'm going to talk in the context of India, which shifted from an agricultural-based economy to a services economy. And now we are focusing a lot on manufacturing through schemes like production-linked incentive schemes. But even under that scheme, we are essentially just changing the assembly of products and not actually manufacturing them. So in this case, how important do you think should be the focus on manufacturing? Because there might be other countries also which are more services oriented now and are switching back to manufacturing or focusing more. So how important is manufacturing, and what is the role that it can play in the growth of these countries?
Great. We come back to you in a second, if you don't mind. So we okay. Do you, Robert?
So we have a number of questions about the nature of manufacturing. One was the identity that people feel with respect to manufacturing. I do think we need to have a deeper sense of the dignity of labor. But it isn't just about manufacturing. In my view, the least appreciated people in our economy are the people who do daycare and deal with young children and who teach. That's an American, particularly a kind of a dignity question and a status question. And so I think we are sorely lacking. I don't know how you change it except through remuneration. To start, there's a great movie, Harry Maguire, and he's negotiating a sportsman's contract, and he says it's not about the money, it's about respect. But they're clearly related. The general question of what works, I'm very suspicious of. You see, I think that the essence of a good industrial policy is that it tackles the appropriate problems effectively. I mean, it isolates certain problems and is effective in dealing with them. And a broad approach is likely to pick winners and losers. And so at the end of the day, we'll say, well, did it work or did it not work? Yes, it failed in some circumstances, and it worked in others. And what those who believe in it hope is that on average, it's going to be better than the alternative. But a real challenge for governments is dealing with failures, because their industrial policies are going to fail, just as any venture capitalist is going to experience failure. And I had this case on Solyndra that I used to teach, which was the company that the Obama administration invested in. And it was an abysmal failure. The firm went bankrupt. It was trying to stimulate solar panels, and the government took an interest in it. So the government was a participant. Now, it so happened that same program, had very generous loans to Tesla. So was the policy a failure or was it a success? Well, so definitely Solyndra was a failure, but overall, in retrospect, it doesn't look that bad. So I think it's not possible. It's not inherently possible to answer the question with sufficient precision in a general way. By the way, people talk about sanctions and they ask, do sanctions work or not? And it's the same kind of question. What were you trying to get the other country to do? You know, sometimes you wanted to do something that was ridiculous or extremely costly for them. At other times, it required a minor change of behavior on their part. So I think I'm suspicious that you can ever answer that question. India did its best for decades to hold its manufacturing sector back because of an ideology of protectionism, where India had such high barriers that they punished products that weren't even made in India. So, and when they liberalized, what they suddenly discovered was they could make things and manufacture things now. But I get the sense that that policy has run out of steam. And so they remain with rather high trade barriers and are resorting now to these subsidies for value addition in manufacturing, of which I am quite suspicious, to be honest, because I don't really, when I talk to the officials, I'm not sure they have compelling criteria. But I will say that if we look back at China, starting with assembly and becoming a key participant in a global supply chain where you don't try to be competitive across the board in the sector, but you do become a competitive location for certain parts of the production process, was what the Chinese did. And then bringing the industry in and then having it gradually increase its localization is a strategy which they employed quite effectively. Now, with the geopolitical tensions, corporations are looking for a China plus one strategy. Apple, just in the last 2 weeks, has received a kick in the rear to increase the rate at which it diversifies the location of its assembly operations. So I think at the moment, this is a very opportune time for countries that are able to establish themselves as attractive locations for assembly, to actually start with that assembly and to build on it. We're seeing Vietnam and Myanmar and Cambodia doing this very effectively, and India and other developing countries, I would like to see them in Africa, ought to be thinking along the same lines.
So, Anna, I would kindly ask you to be concise so that we can have one last round of questions.
Yeah, I don't have that much to add. So I just wanted to say on the social status point that I think one of the bigger issues is partly remuneration, but is partly that manufacturing versus services broadly have sort of split off at the lower education end of the spectrum into good versus bad job equilibria, which don't just involve pay, but also involve a whole host of other things. You think about your typical manufacturing job, and it involves long tenure, sort of working with the same people for a long time, and so some kind of camaraderie, to some extent, depending on the plant, some kind of autonomy of the worker with some kind of level of skill and pride in the skill. And then you switch that to services, and you're often seeing in, say, retail or hospitality, short tenure, shifts that revolve with different people on the shifts all the time, no sense of autonomy, no particular sense of pride or mission in the work. And I think there's a real social goal that we need to meet of transforming those service sector jobs in their wholeness into these good type of jobs that provide dignity and a sense of autonomy and mission, as well as good pay.
So we have 5 more minutes. So we try to collect 3 more questions. I ask everyone to be extremely concise. We start there.
Okay, this is about workers, uneducated. So you were talking about the uneducated workers in the U.S. They are overwhelmingly people who do not vote for this administration. So is it even a realistic political goal? And also the labor union rates are so low in the US. What can even be done realistically by the administration to even change that trend without totally breaking sort of the character of America, as we know, is not very pro-union?
So maybe here, you want to talk some?
Hi, I'm Mike Jacob, a climate economist based at the MCC in Berlin. A very brief question. So one country's industrial policies definitely have impacts on other countries. So there's a very obvious case for policy coordination. And I would like to hear your take on whether we already have solutions and frameworks in place for such policy coordination, A, for industrial policy in general, and B, whether green industrial policies are somehow special and countries should have more policy space, and whether there's maybe some, let's say, some room for this in the international climate regime.
So this one is the last one.
Can you comment on what the best institutional architecture would be for green industrial policy? So when you think about DARPA, for example, the way they got over the information political capture problem is, they employed these scientists who are at the frontier of scientific research, who can make these bets more intelligently, but then they were only appointed for 3 years, so they could prevent that kind of political capture. So what would be the institutional architecture for green industrial policy to make it successful?
So you have both 1 minute each to answer. Exactly.
1 minute. Well, I'll just speak to the labor question then, since that's my main expertise. Just on the low education point, on average, people without a college education voted for Democrats. So like on net, they voted for this administration. But the unusual swing with the Trump era was that they were more likely to vote for Trump than they had been for prior Republicans. But in terms of unionization, yeah, it would be a huge mission to raise private sector unionization to anything resembling what it used to be. It was 1 in 3 in the 1950s, it's 6% today. There are some things that can be done that are around changing the legal status of unions in the US, some obvious fixes like changing penalties around violating labor law. But to get a really broad, I think the general consensus is what would need to be done is something much bigger in terms of changing the structure, for example, towards sectoral bargaining or towards much more mandating of labor within public procurement, or as has partly been done with these subsidies in a softer way. Because the establishment level bargaining structure of the US is such that it's just very, very difficult incrementally even to maintain the existing level of unionization, because unions are going out of business and people are leaving the workforce and firms are leaving. So there's a strong momentum going in the other direction.
Robert?
So green industrial policies. So I think one huge issue is that most of the framing of our industrial policies here has been national in the way we've been talking about it. But knowledge is global of the green transition. I think there needs to be a much different structure when it comes to financing and collaboration in green technologies. We've seen incredible declines in solar costs to the point where today they are the cheap form of producing energy. So that's a spectacular example of was a combined effort. It was mainly European subsidies for electric vehicles that led to these tremendous innovations in China in the production of electric vehicles. Not to say that later on, the Chinese didn't come along and add their own subsidies. But I think when we think green, we should not think national. And basically, yes, countries should be contributing, but if we'd adopted that same approach for vaccines, we wouldn't have gotten a vaccine in as quick in just a year, because it was like many things made in the world. And I think the same goes for know-how, where I think a key contribution can come from globalizing the R&D.
So we are perfectly in time. So I want to thank Robert and Anna for sharing their insights. Thanks a lot for everyone for showing up, and have a nice rest of the day.